First of all, a massive thank you to Chris and to Catapult for inviting me to talk today, and a massive thank you to you guys for presenting as well. I've really enjoyed listening to your talks, and hopefully we'll see some sort of common threads and maybe some differences within this one as well. A little anecdote, the first sports science conference I ever went to was the Satellite Symposium at the ECSS, so it's a real pleasure for me to be here to talk to you guys today. So what I've been asked to discuss, and bear in mind I'm relatively new into this role as well, so I'm working a lot of this stuff out myself at the moment, is an international perspective on having a healthy experience for the elite youth player. So what I'd like to do is take you through the context that we're working in within the English football team at the moment, what we feel, or to kind of put a little a definition on what we feel a healthy experience is for these players, or more specifically, what the decision-making process we like to go through a little bit more consistently will be to make sure that our players can have a healthy experience, but also to make sure that we can win international tournaments. What we found, look at some of the work that we've done so far and what that meant to us, the information we've gathered, and what I think the next step should be, or what we're trying to try and do this season. Okay, so international football. For those who aren't familiar, there's five. Is that five? Yep, there's 5 training camps a year, which 4 of those involve qualifying campaigns or friendly matches for major international tournaments. That's right the way through from under 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 up to the senior team. And that's in the women's game as well as the men's game as well. Typically around the June-July period, this will end up with an international tournament of some sort, either over 20 to 50 days. So you can see here the kind of limit, we have these limited periods of time and very, very short, intense periods of time with players. We're usually travelling within that period of time as well. We usually have different players coming in and out of different camps. So maybe the same squad you get from one camp won't be the same to the next camp, to the next camp, to the next. We might have changing coaching staff, which has happened quite a lot this season. Yeah, and some of our priorities as well, like maybe they're not about the physical development or physical development within that period of time. Maybe it's just about getting the team more cohesive and learning the systems and the style of play that we're trying to develop within that very, very short period of time. And again, recognising that that might be different from camp to camp. So at the moment, the situation we're in at the moment is every single time we turn up to a camp across all these different age groups, all these different teams, we've got a slightly new or different experience. And that's for the players and that's for the coaches and the support staff as well. On top of that as well, we have multiple clubs that are feeding the different teams as well. So if I was to put my club hat on, that must be an absolute nightmare for you guys, because you're going to have this one club here, for example, will be feeding players from one team into 3 of our different teams. So that might be our under 18, under 19, under 20. So 3 different players for 3 different teams, and they might all be training with or playing for the under 23s at Manchester United, for example. And that will be happening across lots of different clubs, all the different clubs, and across all the different age groups. So the clubs have got multiple contacts across the FA, so across the different international teams, and they'll be also having, so the same player who's coming back into their training environment is going to be having, is going to be having a very, very different international experience. Sounds good, doesn't it? And finally, one of the other things which I find really interesting from my perspective is the different approaches taken by the different clubs. So Adam really kindly shared, and so has Tony, the typical training weeks or training structures that the players are likely to go through on a weekly basis. But of course, this varies from club to club. So club to club's got very, very different training structures. The physical conditioners and the coaches within the clubs have sometimes got very strongly held beliefs about what they should be and what their players are capable of doing on different days. So that means that when you come into the international environment, you have some players that are used to a kind of rhythm like that, some are used to a rhythm like that. Some people can tolerate this much, some people can tolerate that much. So again, every single player is coming into the international environment with a very different training history and a very, very different experience. I suppose what that means in terms of putting a training program together or putting an international development program together to make sure that you have a healthy experience for these players. There's so much of it which is you're absolutely unable to control. So we have to think slightly differently about how we go and approach that. And this is the approach that we're taking at the moment. So what we want to try and do is get a really, really clear and good handle on what the camp or that particular competition or our training objectives are for that period of time, or hopefully longer term as well. So for that development phase, or for that year, or for that one particular point in time, what are our objectives? So rather than talking about what should the loading be, or what is the plan, and base it on some sort of methodology or certain system of training, let's think about what it is that we're actually trying to broadly achieve here. And again, let's look about the three things that could maybe stop a player from having a healthy experience within an international training environment. And they are things like their training and competition history, how much work they've been exposed to, how much chronic load they've accumulated, for example, their injury vulnerability, what's their recent injury history, what things might lead them to be more vulnerable to injury, and what's their physical capability. How physically capable are they of absorbing the training stresses which we think might be coming their way associated with the objectives. And then from that point then, we can then put a training plan together. So our training plan, or our competition plan, or our camp plan becomes a product, but from a group perspective and an individual perspective, of the objectives and the capability of the players to deliver that, their training history or their competition history and their injury vulnerability. And of course, on a day-by-day basis, we're looking at the performance, so how they've actually done, how they've delivered it in that, and their response to exposure. So have they fatigued? Has there been levels of fatigue associated with that to continue to remodel and redesign? So that's the position that we're at the moment. That's the approach we're taking. And this is what we're finding. So this is some of the information that we've been collecting so far. So what we've got here is, this is with one of our squads. This is the average, this is our long list of our squad, all the different players down on the x-axis here. This is the number of minutes, average minutes per week over a complete season they've played in either the Championship or the Premiership. The players in red are the ones that were selected for the international tournament at the end of the season, and the ones that are highlighted in black just around the outside are the ones who started regularly for the team during that competition. So you can see here the type of players that we're getting in, like that we're getting in, are having hugely different competition exposures. Some player here who's on 100 minutes per week, maybe he's much more likely to be able to absorb 3 games a week, which we might be going into in a tournament, versus the player at the back end of that spectrum, number 34, who's only on sort of 15 or 16 minutes a week. So we have to account for these players when they come in. Interestingly, as a little anecdote, players number 2 and number 34 were the only 2 players within this particular tournament to sustain a soft tissue injury, or heavy DOMS, really what it was, within this period of time, within this tournament. So just because you have low minutes doesn't necessarily mean that you won't be able to tolerate the competition demands. Just because you have really high minutes doesn't either anyway. The next thing we're looking at now is our physical profiling. So what is the physical capability of the players to tolerate international football, the demands of international football? So we know what their competition exposure is. We have an understanding of what they've got coming into the training camps, into these international camps and tournaments. Now, how about their capability to absorb that? So what we've done here is we've looked at, let's take the graph on your right-hand side here. What we've looked at is the amount of high-speed running per minute on the x-axis there. Low versus high is determined by a Z-score, so what your Z-score away from the mean is. And higher and low capability of your hamstring, so how strong your hamstring measured with an isometric hamstring pull. Again, what we've done is we've established a benchmark and what your Z-score is away from that benchmark. So the idea being as well, if you're coming into an international competition and you've got to do an enormous amount of high-speed running per game typically, and we're going to back those up 3 or 4 times within a very, very short period of time, and you've got a low competition exposure, and you're weak, you might be more susceptible to some sort of soft tissue injury or maybe an unhealthy experience within an international tournament. So that means we can start having those conversations with our coaches and say we can either monitor or manage our training loads around that particular player, talk about selection issues with them, and maybe work with that player individually and the club to see if we can put a longer term training program in place to make sure that they've got the strength to be able to tolerate the tournament demands. So overall they have a much healthier experience. As an aside, we do the same thing for decelerations and lower limb strength as well. So the volumes of decelerations and the lower limb strength as well. Again, this is what our response to exposure. So it's a kind of catapult GPS conference. I thought I'd show you a little bit of GPS data, or at least how we manage that type of information that comes in. We're really fortunate that we have a fantastic relationship with most of the clubs that we operate with. And what we try and do is capture 2 to 3 weeks of training load data from the clubs before they come into international camp. Then what we do, because we know that between each club we're going to be getting different durations and different numbers of days of information coming in, we can't really apply the traditional maybe acute chronic ratio towards it. So what we try to do is calculate the training strain that player is used to on a weekly basis, so what the average training strain is over that period of time that we've got the information for, and compare that on a daily basis to the training strain that's been accumulated so far on training camp. So then we can start looking at their recent training history with what they've recently accumulated, and then look at their fatigue responses to that. Okay, so then what we've started to build is a much bigger profile of this is your competition exposure, this is your physical capability, here's what your recent training history is compared to what you've done so far, and then here's how you responded to it. And if all 4 or 5 things are starting to stack up that you're not responding too well, then we can start having a conversation about how we manage the workloads that they might be undertaking within that camp, or have a conversation with the clubs about how we can improve these players' physical capability to tolerate, which is a kind of unflexible international demands of competition. So now I'd like to talk to you now about kind of what we're going to look at next, particularly over the next season. So at the moment I've just demonstrated or showed you some data we've collected from volume of work, essentially what volume are the players used to compared to what volume are they accumulating with us. What we haven't spoken about is the density of work or the intensity of that work. One of the things that I'm really keen to explore this season is looking at our international training versus international competition. When we train the players, are we actually physically preparing them for the international demands of competition? So these are just 2 snapshots here where we can see here the red part of the pie chart here. This is the total number of minutes accumulated in training during a March camp with one of our squads, and only 64 minutes. So that's, I think it was about 23% of the entire training time was done at match tempo, at or above match tempo. So are we actually physically preparing our players for the demands of international competition, or even just to play with each other, to learn how it is to play with each other at that kind of tempo? Is this something that needs to flex or change or improve, particularly in the build-up to major international tournaments? And are our players physically capable of delivering that? And if they're not, how can we work with the players and the clubs to make sure that they become capable of doing that? Because that could be something which is going to help us win major international competitions. And again, same, what we've looked at here is, on the right-hand side, is the number of repeated high-intensity efforts. So every time there's a significant acceleration, deceleration or sprint, more than 3 times over within a 30-second window, and looked at that per minute, per training minute, or per competition minute. And again, what you can see is that some training sessions include the RS means repeated sprints. So including when we've done repeated sprint activity, repeated sprint training within sessions, are starting to match towards it, but we're still not training with the same density of intensive work within training as we are in international competition. So if we want to win stuff, it seems logical that we need to prepare the players for the physical demand of that type of activity, and we're not necessarily doing that within training at this particular point in time. Take another step back. Are the players physically capable? Have they got the recent training history and the competition history to absorb that type of work? And I think then we're starting to build a picture of how we can create a kind of winning international experience as a healthy one for the players. Objective setting, a little bit of a boring one, and I have spelt objectives wrong on here. I'm going to fall out with you. One of the things I think we need to do a much better job of this season as well is essentially set much better physical objectives for, generic objectives, but also physical objectives for the camp and for the players. What are the implications of our playing style? What does that mean across one match for our game plan, but also across a tournament? Because these are the things that are going to help us pick out how we're going to train our players better, and then therefore how physically prepared they need to be for that to create a better experience for them. And then also marrying that with maybe some more long-term objectives rather than just looking camp to camp or campaign to campaign. And this really is my final point as well, which is right on time. The thing that I'm most keen to do, and the thing that I'd like to do most this season, is to build a much better relationships with the clubs. And rather than looking at things on a week-to-week or camp-to-camp and trying to repeat the same week twice basis, rather than looking at it, go, well, I take the Spanish periodisation model, we use a German one, we use an English one, we use a Portuguese one. Let's see if we can look at things over a much longer period of time. So this is a typical period of time. So September, October, November international camps. They're the players are with us for a similar amount of time as they are with the clubs, and then if you put a pre-season or the start of the season as August on top of that, let's see if we can establish mutual objectives within that period of time. Let's see if we can identify mutual periods of opportunity to develop and train these players based on what we think their expected physical demand is going to be within international competition, and then plan accordingly so they can have a much better experience, not just within international football, but also within their clubs as well. That's all from me. Thank you very much.